The day he was fired, the wind cut across the plains so hard it felt personal. It was the kind of wind that carried dust in summer and ice in winter, the kind that had shaped men and broken them for generations. He stood outside the ranch office with his hat pulled low and his jaw set tight, listening to the door slam behind him. 30 years of honest work ended with a few sharp words and a final paycheck folded thin as a church bulletin. All because of an old horse. The horse had been with the ranch longer than most of the hands. A gray gelding with tired eyes and a scar along his flank from a barbed wire fence years ago. He had hauled calves through mud, pulled wagons in spring thaw, and carried children who were too small to hold the reins steady. Age had bent his back and slowed his stride, but there was still something steady in him, something proud. The ranch owner did not see pride. He saw cost. "Not worth the feed," the man had said that morning, looking out over the pasture. "He's done." But the cowboy had grown up believing a man's word mattered. He had also grown up believing loyalty went both ways. You did not cast aside a creature that had given its life to your work. So when he found out the gray was to be sold cheap at auction, likely to end up somewhere worse than hard labor, he made a choice that cost him everything. He loaded the horse into his own trailer before dawn. By noon, he no longer had a job. Now he stood alone with the gray beside him, both of them breathing clouds into the cold air. The other ranch hands avoided his eyes. Some looked sorry. Some looked afraid they might be next. Out here, jobs were thin as rain in August. No one wanted to cross the boss. He reached up and rubbed the horse's neck. The old gelding leaned into his hand, slow and gentle. That was when he knew he did not regret it. He had a little money saved. Not much, enough to last a few months if he stretched it thin. He could have looked for work at another ranch. There were always places needing strong backs and quiet men, but word traveled fast across county lines. A man fired for going against his employer was not an easy hire. So he did something no one expected. He bought a cabin for $3. It sat on a patch of land high in the hills where snow came early and stayed late. The cabin had once belonged to a trapper who had passed on without heirs. The land had been tangled in paperwork for years until it ended up in a county sale no one paid attention to. The structure was little more than a shell. The roof sagged. Half the boards were warped from weather. The door hung crooked on one hinge. $3 and a handshake later, it was his. Folks in town laughed when they heard about it. They said the winter would swallow him whole. They said the cabin would fall down before spring. They said a man with no steady income and an old horse to feed had no business chasing stubborn dreams in the mountains. He did not argue. He just loaded what little he owned into his truck, tied the gray behind the cab, and drove toward the hills as the sky turned heavy with snow. The first night in the cabin was colder than any night he had known in a bunkhouse. The wind found every crack in the boards. The fire pit inside barely held a flame. He wrapped himself in 2 old quilts and listened to the horse shifting outside under a rough shelter he had built from scrap wood. He wondered if he had made a mistake. But when morning came, pale and quiet, he stepped outside and saw the gray standing in the fresh snow, head lifted toward the sun, and something inside him steadied. The horse was home, and now so was he. Days turned into weeks. He patched the roof with tin sheets he found at a salvage yard. He chopped fallen timber for firewood. He cleared brush from the small field behind the cabin, uncovering soil that had not seen a plow in years. It was not much land, but it was his. The old American way, his father used to say, was not about owning the biggest spread. It was about owning your own choices. The gray horse followed him like a shadow. Though too old for heavy work, he still pulled a small sled of firewood and carried light loads. The cowboy spoke to him the way some men spoke to brothers. In the quiet of the hills, words felt different, honest. Money ran thin by the second month. He sold a saddle he had once been proud of. He picked up odd jobs in town, fixing fences and clearing snow from shop fronts. Each dollar went toward feed, nails, flour, and coffee. Then something strange began to happen. A woman from town drove up the hill one afternoon in a dusty pickup. She said she had heard about the man who lost his job for saving an old horse. She had a lame mare that needed gentle handling. Would he take a look? He did. The mare calmed under his steady hands. Word spread. Soon, a rancher brought a skittish colt no one could saddle without trouble. A boy came with a pony that bit and kicked. Each time, the cowboy worked slow and patient, never raising his voice, never striking in anger. He did not charge much, just enough to cover feed and a little extra. People started driving up the hill more often. They saw the patched roof and the thin smoke rising from the chimney. They saw the gray horse grazing quietly in the field. They saw a man who had chosen loyalty over comfort, and they respected it. Spring crept in slowly. Snow melted into narrow streams that ran down the hillside. The small field behind the cabin began to show green. He planted beans and corn in neat rows, hands deep in the soil. The gray watched from the fence line, ears twitching at every bird that passed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky gold, the cowboy stood at the edge of his land and looked out over the valley. He could see the distant lights of the ranch where he had once worked. He felt no bitterness now, only a quiet strength. He had lost a job. He had lost a steady paycheck. But he had found something else. Freedom. Still, freedom came with a price. Late that summer, a black car rolled up the dirt road to the cabin. It was not a truck from town. It was not a rancher bringing a horse. The car was clean and sharp, out of place among the dust and pine trees. A man in a press suit stepped out. He did not look like he had ever shoveled snow or mended a fence. The cowboy wiped his hands on his jeans and walked down to meet him. "I hear you're the one who bought this property," the suited man said, glancing around with thin interest. "That's right." The man nodded once. "You may not be aware, but this land sits on something valuable." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and earth. The gray horse lifted his head from the grass and watched. "Valuable how?" the cowboy asked. The suited man smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "There are plans for development in this area, roads, buildings, investment. Your cabin and the surrounding acreage are part of it." The cowboy felt a slow tightening in his chest. "I'm not selling," he said plainly. "You haven't heard my offer." "Doesn't matter." The man's smile faded. "Everything has a price. Maybe that was true in the city. Maybe it was true in boardrooms and banks. But up in the hills, under a sky that seemed bigger than the world itself, the rules felt different." The cowboy looked back at his cabin, at the field he had cleared with his own hands, at the gray horse who had cost him his job and given him a new life. "I paid $3 for this place," he said quietly. "Best money I ever spent." The suited man studied him for a long moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folder thick with papers. "You might want to read these," he said. "Because if you don't sell willingly, there are other ways this can go." He handed over the folder and walked back to the black car. Gravel crunched under the tires as the vehicle turned and disappeared down the hill. The cowboy stood there, papers in hand, the wind tugging at the edges. He did not open them right away. He did not need to. He knew trouble when he saw it. The gray horse walked up beside him and nudged his shoulder gently. The simple touch grounded him. He had fought for this place. He had built it from nothing, and he had done it for the right reasons. As the sun dipped below the ridge and shadows stretched long across the field, he finally opened the folder. His eyes moved slowly over the printed words, over maps and signatures and seals. By the time he finished reading, the sky had gone dark. He folded the papers carefully and looked out across his land once more. They thought he was just a fired ranch hand with an old horse and a falling-down cabin. They had no idea what they were about to wake up. They thought he was just a fired ranch hand with an old horse and a falling-down cabin. They had no idea what they were about to wake up. He stood in the doorway long after dark, the folder resting heavy in his hands. The wind had settled, leaving the hills quiet in a way that made small sounds feel loud. The gray horse shifted in the pasture, hooves pressing softly into the earth. Somewhere in the trees an owl called once and went silent. He stepped inside and set the folder on the rough wooden table he had built from scrapboards. The cabin still smelled of fresh-cut pine and smoke. It was not much, but it had become something solid to him. Every nail in the wall carried a memory of cold mornings and steady work. He lit the lantern and opened the papers again. Most of it was written in the kind of language meant to confuse a man, long sentences. Sharp words like acquisition and mineral rights and state approval. There were maps of the hillside with clean lines drawn straight through his field, cutting across the patch where corn had grown taller than his shoulder. But one page caught his eye more than the rest. It showed a shaded section directly beneath his land. A note in small print mentioned survey results from decades ago. He read it twice before the meaning settled in. The land was believed to hold a rare mineral deposit. He leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. He was no expert in geology or big business. He knew horses, soil, and weather, but he understood one thing clearly. If men in pressed suits were driving up dirt roads to talk about development, then the land under his boots was worth far more than $3. The next morning he rode into town on the gray. The old horse moved slow but steady, ears flicking at the sound of passing trucks. Folks looked up as he passed along Main Street. Some tipped their hats, others watched with quiet curiosity. News traveled fast in small places. He tied the gray outside the hardware store and stepped inside. The owner, an older man with sawdust on his sleeves, glanced up from the counter. "Seen that fancy car head up your way yesterday?" he said, not wasting time. "Heard they're sniffing around the hills again." "Sniffing for what?" the cowboy asked. The store owner shrugged. "Same thing they've been chasing for years. There was talk back in the 70s about minerals in that ridge. Company sent survey crews, drilled a few test holes. Then it all went quiet. Folks figured it was nothing. Nothing doesn't bring men in suits," the cowboy said. The owner gave a thin smile. "No, it doesn't." He bought a coil of rope and a small bag of feed before heading back outside. A younger ranch hand, one he used to work beside, approached him near the hitching post. "You planning to sell?" the young man asked, eyes cautious. "No," the ranch hand glanced up toward the hills. "They won't like that." The cowboy studied him. "You ever seen them push someone off land they own?" The young man hesitated. "I've seen banks do worse." That answer stayed with him on the ride home. When he reached the cabin, he noticed something that made his grip tighten on the reins. Fresh tire tracks cut through the dirt near his fence. He had smoothed that ground himself just days ago. These tracks were new. He dismounted slowly and walked the length of the fence line. Nothing appeared broken. The cabin door stood just as he had left it, but the feeling of being watched lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. He checked on the gray first. The horse lifted his head and gave a soft huff, calm as ever. That eased him some. Inside the cabin, nothing looked disturbed. The folder lay where he had left it. Still, he moved carefully, scanning corners, listening for any sound out of place. He told himself it was likely just curiosity. Maybe someone had driven up to take a look at the land. In a small town, land deals were better entertainment than the local radio. But deep down, he knew curiosity did not leave clean, deliberate tire tracks that circled his property and stopped near the field. Over the next week, more cars appeared on the road below the hill. Some slowed as they passed. A few turned around and drove back. Once, he caught a glimpse of the same black car parked at a distance near the tree line. He kept working. Each morning he rose before sunrise, fed the gray, and tended to the small garden. He reinforced the fence posts and began digging shallow trenches along the edge of his land. If they were going to push, he wanted to be ready. One afternoon, a local schoolteacher came with her son and a nervous pony. While he worked with the animal, the teacher spoke quietly. "My brother works at the county office," she said. "He mentioned a proposal filed last month, big development plan. They're calling it progress." "Progress for who?" he asked, adjusting the pony's bridle. She looked toward the hills. "Not for the people who live there." When they left, he felt the weight of the situation settle deeper. This was no simple offer. It was a plan set in motion long before he bought the cabin. That night, as he sat by the fire, he remembered something his father once told him. Land holds stories. And sometimes those stories are worth more than what lies beneath. He began to wonder about the trapper who had owned the cabin before him. The man had lived alone for years. Some in town said he was stubborn. Others said he knew things most folks ignored. The cabin had been left untouched for a long time after his passing. No one wanted it. Why had the survey crews stopped decades ago? Why had the land sat forgotten until now? The next day, he saddled the gray and rode farther up the ridge than he had before. Snowmelt had carved narrow channels through the rock. Pine trees stood thick and tall. After an hour he found something half buried in brush. A rusted metal marker. He brushed dirt away with his glove and revealed faded letters stamped into the surface. It matched the map in the folder, a boundary marker from the old survey. But beside it, hidden under moss, was something else. A small wooden box wedged into the ground. He hesitated before opening it. Inside lay a stack of brittle papers wrapped in oilcloth. They looked old, older than the cabin. He carried them back home and spread them across his table. They were handwritten notes, sketches of the ridge, observations about the soil and rock formations. The trapper's handwriting was rough but clear. One line stood out. "They are not telling the whole truth about what lies here." He read it again. There were references to water contamination in a nearby creek during the old drilling tests, mentions of livestock falling ill, a warning about what deep extraction could do to the hillside. His jaw tightened. This was not just about money. It was about what would happen if they tore into the mountain. 2 days later, a letter arrived in his mailbox at the bottom of the hill. It was formal and direct. The company intended to proceed with legal action to acquire necessary parcels for development. It suggested cooperation would be in his best interest. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the folder. That evening, the black car returned. This time it stopped at the edge of his property. The suited man stepped out again, hands in his coat pockets. "You've had time to think," the man said calmly. "I've done more than think," the cowboy replied. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't understand the scale of what's coming. This project has backing, state approval, investors who expect results. And what happens to the creek below the ridge?" the cowboy asked. "What happens to the soil when you start digging?" The suited man's expression did not change. "Environmental impact has been reviewed." "By who?" "By professionals." The cowboy felt a quiet anger rise, but he kept his voice steady. "The last time professionals drilled up here, livestock got sick, water turned bad." The man tilted his head slightly. "That was decades ago. Different methods, different standards. And if it goes wrong, it won't." The certainty in that answer unsettled him more than anything. The suited man stepped closer. "We're offering you more money than you've ever seen. Enough to buy 10 cabins. Enough to retire." "I'm not looking to retire." The wind picked up, rustling through the trees. The gray horse moved closer to the fence, ears pinned back slightly at the stranger's tone. "You're one man," the suited man said quietly. "You can't stand in the way of progress." The cowboy met his gaze. "Maybe not, but I can make it harder." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then the suited man gave a thin smile again. "You might want to be careful," he said. "Obstacles tend to get removed." He turned and walked back to the car. That night, long after the engine noise faded, the cowboy sat outside under the stars. The hills looked peaceful, almost gentle in the moonlight. It was hard to imagine machines carving them open. He thought about the town, the schoolteacher, the ranch hands, the creek that ran clear every spring. He thought about the trapper's notes and the warning written in faded ink. He had stumbled into something bigger than a land deal. The gray horse lowered his head onto his shoulder for a brief moment, a quiet show of trust. He reached up and held the reins loosely, feeling the steady warmth beside him. He did not have lawyers or investors. He did not have deep pockets. What he had was time, stubbornness, and the truth buried in those old papers. As he stared out into the dark, he noticed a faint light flicker high on the ridge, far beyond where any house stood. It glowed for a moment, then vanished. His pulse quickened. Someone else was already up there. And whatever they were doing, they were not waiting for him to agree. The light on the ridge did not come back the next night, but that did not settle him. It stayed in his mind like a splinter under the skin. He woke before dawn and stepped outside with his boots half-laced, scanning the hillside while the sky was still gray. The air felt different, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. He saddled the gray and rode toward where he had seen the flicker. The old horse climbed steady, hooves careful over loose rock. As they neared the crest, he spotted fresh disturbance in the soil. Small flags marked in bright orange had been pushed into the ground at measured intervals. They were not there the day before. He dismounted and pulled one up. It had a printed code on it, along with the name of the development company. He stared at the letters for a long moment, then looked out across the valley. From up there, he could see nearly every acre of land the project would touch. Fields, fences, the thin line of the creek that curved like a silver thread through town. He felt anger rise again, but it was different this time. It was not just about his cabin or the $3 land. It was about what would be lost if men who had never lived there made the decisions. On his way back down, he noticed another set of tracks crossing the ridge. These were from heavy tires, deeper and wider than a car. Survey equipment, maybe, or something more. By midday, word had spread in town that crews were expected within the week. The cafe buzzed with low conversations. Some people spoke of jobs and growth. Others looked worried but kept their voices down. He sat alone at a corner table with a cup of black coffee, listening. A rancher from the east side leaned across the counter. "They say it could bring in millions," the rancher said. "Roads fixed, new stores. Maybe even a clinic." "And what do they take in return?" the cowboy asked quietly. The rancher shrugged. "Land's just dirt until someone makes money off it." That line stung more than it should have. Later that afternoon, he stopped by the county office. The building smelled of old paper and polish. A clerk who had known him since he was a boy handed him a copy of the public proposal. It outlined a mining operation with timelines, environmental assurances, and promises of community investment. He flipped through the pages slowly. Everything looked clean on paper: studies, approvals, signatures from officials in distant cities. "Has anyone here actually read this?" he asked. The clerk lowered her voice. "Some of us have. Not everyone is convinced." "Then why is it moving forward?" she hesitated. "Because money talks louder than doubt." When he stepped back into the sunlight, he felt the weight of the situation more clearly. This was not a simple land dispute. It was a battle between promises and reality, between those who saw opportunity and those who feared consequence. Back at the cabin, he found a wooden stake driven into the edge of his field. A red ribbon fluttered from it. He pulled it free and tossed it aside, jaw tight. The gray stood near the fence, watching him. The horse sensed tension. Animals always did. That evening, the schoolteacher returned, this time alone. She climbed out of her truck and walked up the path with a determined look. "My brother gave me something," she said, holding out a small envelope. "Internal notes from a preliminary water test they ran last month. They did not include it in the public report." He opened it carefully. The numbers meant little to him at first glance, but one line had been circled in pen. "Elevated risk of contamination if excavation extends beyond projected depth." "They're minimizing the risk," she said. "The official report only mentions minimal impact under ideal conditions." He nodded slowly. "And what happens when conditions aren't ideal?" She did not answer. She did not have to. Over the next few days, more perspectives began to surface. A young mechanic in town admitted he hoped for construction work. He had a newborn at home and bills stacking up. An older farmer feared the loss of grazing land. A small business owner imagined more customers. The conflict ran through the town like a fault line, invisible but ready to split. One night, a rock struck the side of his cabin. Not hard enough to break anything, but loud enough to jolt him awake. He stepped outside with a lantern, scanning the darkness. He saw no one, but he heard the distant roar of an engine fading down the road. He stood there for a long time, listening. The next morning, he found deep tire ruts cutting across the lower edge of his property. They had not asked permission. He rode into town and confronted the suited man outside the temporary office they had set up near the old feed warehouse. "You're trespassing," he said evenly. The man adjusted his tie. "Preliminary access for assessment. Entirely legal under the pending acquisition process. I have not sold. You're holding out. On purpose." The suited man studied him with something like impatience. "You're creating tension in a town that needs unity. I'm asking questions, and questions can slow progress." The words sounded practiced, rehearsed. As he turned to leave, he noticed a familiar face inside the office. The ranch owner who had fired him stood near a table covered in maps. Their eyes met briefly through the window. So that was it. The ranch had likely signed on already. Large tracts of land meant leverage. If his small parcel sat in the middle of the project area, it complicated things. Back at the cabin, he dug deeper into the trapper's old notes. There were references to a second set of survey results that never made it to official records. Mentions of a geologist who had expressed concern and then disappeared from the project shortly after. He began asking around discreetly. An elderly man at the barber shop remembered a government team visiting decades ago. Said they packed up faster than expected, no explanation given. He started to piece together a pattern. Every time serious extraction was considered on that ridge, something halted it, and then silence followed. One afternoon, while clearing brush near the creek, he noticed the water running slightly cloudy. It had rained the night before, but not enough to justify the color. He knelt and dipped his hand in. The chill bit into his skin. Upstream, near the ridge, he saw fresh, churned earth. They were already testing deeper than they admitted. He returned home with a heaviness in his chest. The gray followed close, as if aware that something larger than either of them was unfolding. That evening, a group of townsfolk gathered outside his cabin. Not a mob, not angry, just concerned. The schoolteacher, the mechanic, the ranch hand, and a few others stood together. "We need to talk," the teacher said. They sat around a small fire pit under the open sky. Each person spoke in turn, fears, hopes, questions. The mechanic admitted he wanted the job but did not want poisoned water. The ranch hand worried about losing pasture but feared speaking up. The older farmer spoke of soil passed down through generations. The cowboy listened more than he spoke. "They're dividing us," the ranch hand said finally. "Maybe," the cowboy replied. "Or maybe we're dividing ourselves." Silence followed. He laid the trapper's notes on the ground for them to see. He showed the water test numbers. He described the light on the ridge and the heavy tire tracks. "They're moving faster than we thought," he said. "And they're not waiting for all the answers." The teacher looked at him. "What are you planning?" He stared into the fire for a long moment. "I'm planning to slow them down. How? I don't know yet." In the days that followed, tension thickened. Survey crews began marking more ground. Trucks rolled in before sunrise and left after dark. The sound of distant machinery echoed through the hills. At the same time, whispers grew in town. Some accused him of blocking opportunity. Others thanked him quietly for standing firm. The ranch owner sent a message through a mutual acquaintance. "Sell now, while the offer is high. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." He ignored it. Then came a notice posted at the bottom of his hill. A public hearing scheduled for the following week. Community input invited. He knew what that meant. A formal show of process, speeches, charts, reassurances. That night, he sat at his table with the lantern low and the gray visible through the window. He thought about the life he had built in just a few months. About the freedom he had tasted after losing his job for saving an old horse. He thought about how quickly that freedom could be stripped away. The wind rose again, rattling the cabin walls. In the distance, he heard the rumble of engines climbing the ridge long after dark. He stepped outside and looked toward the source of the sound. Multiple lights moved slowly along the mountain path, brighter and more numerous than before. They were not waiting for the hearing, they were already digging deeper. And he was running out of time to find out exactly what they were trying so hard to keep buried. By the time the public hearing drew near, the hills no longer felt quiet. Engines echoed at odd hours. Survey flags multiplied like weeds after rain. Even the birds seemed to avoid the upper ridge where the machines had begun to bite into the earth. He barely slept the night before the hearing. The lantern burned low while he sat at the table, reading the trapper's notes again and again. The old handwriting felt less like history now and more like a warning passed from one stubborn man to another. He had copied the most important parts onto fresh paper, careful and slow, making sure he could read every word clearly. The gray stood outside the cabin, shifting restlessly. The horse had grown thinner through the winter but stronger through the spring. Saving that old animal had cost him his job, yet it had also led him here. Sometimes he wondered if the path had been set the moment he chose loyalty over a paycheck. Just before dawn, he stepped outside with a bucket of water. He paused halfway across the yard. The ground near the fence looked disturbed again. He crouched down and pressed his hand into the soil. It was loose, recently turned. Not by him. His eyes followed a faint trail leading toward the ridge. They were testing even closer now. He saddled the gray without hesitation. The public hearing would not start until afternoon. He had time to see for himself what they were doing. The climb felt steeper than usual. As they neared the marked boundary, he heard the low hum of machinery. Not loud enough to shake the valley, but steady and deliberate. He guided the horse through a narrow gap in the trees and stopped short. A temporary drilling rig stood where the old metal survey marker had once been. Workers in hard hats moved around it with practiced efficiency. A truck idled nearby, its back loaded with sealed containers. He felt a rush of anger, then forced himself to breathe. One of the workers noticed him and stepped forward. "This area is restricted," the man said politely but firmly. "This is my land," he replied. The worker glanced toward the truck. A familiar figure stepped out. The suited man adjusted his coat and walked over. "You should not be here," the suited man said calmly. "You should not be drilling," he answered. "It's a preliminary assessment. Nothing permanent." He looked at the drill bit biting into the earth. "That looks permanent enough," the suited man's expression tightened. "You are creating unnecessary drama. The public hearing will address concerns. You're already digging before the hearing." The suited man did not deny it. "We are operating within our rights." The words felt rehearsed again, polished like the man's shoes. He rode back down the ridge with his jaw set. If they were willing to push this far before facing the town, what would they do afterward? By midday, the community hall was full. Ranchers in worn hats, shop owners in pressed shirts, young couples with restless children. The development company had set up a projector and neat display boards filled with charts and glossy images of future roads and clean facilities. He took a seat near the back. The schoolteacher sat beside him, hands folded tightly in her lap. The mechanic stood near the wall, eyes moving between the speakers and the crowd. The presentation began with promises: economic growth, job opportunities, improved infrastructure, environmental safeguards. The suited man took the floor and spoke with smooth confidence. He described advanced mining techniques and minimal impact. He mentioned partnerships with state agencies and independent review panels. Then he opened the floor to questions. An older farmer stood first. "What about the creek?" he asked. "It runs through my pasture. My cattle drink from it." The suited man nodded. "Our environmental assessment shows no significant risk to local water sources." He felt the room shift, tension rising like heat. When his turn came, he stood slowly. He did not rush to the front. He simply raised his voice enough to carry. "You're already drilling beyond the initial survey line," he said. "I saw it this morning." Murmurs spread through the hall. The suited man held his gaze. "Preliminary exploration is within approved parameters." He pulled the copied notes from his pocket. "The last time exploration went deep on that ridge, livestock got sick and the creek turned cloudy. That was written down by the man who owned my cabin before me." A few heads turned toward him. The suited man's tone cooled slightly. "Historical anecdotes do not replace modern data." He held up the water test results the schoolteacher had given him. "What about these numbers?" "Elevated contamination risk if excavation goes deeper than projected." Silence filled the room. The suited man glanced briefly at someone near the projector, then back at the crowd. "Those figures are preliminary and have been addressed in our updated assessment." "Where is that update?" he asked. "It will be made available." "When?" The tension felt thick enough to touch. The ranch owner who had fired him rose from his seat near the front. "This project will bring money to this town," the ranch owner said firmly. "We can't cling to the past forever." He looked at the man he had once worked for. "This isn't about clinging to the past. It's about protecting what we already have." Voices began to overlap. Some in support of development, others demanding clearer answers. The hearing shifted from a calm presentation to something raw and uncertain. Eventually, the moderator called for order. Promises were made to release more detailed reports. The hearing ended without resolution. Outside, the air felt heavy. Groups gathered in the parking lot, talking in low voices. The mechanic approached him. "You made them nervous," the mechanic said quietly. "Good," he replied, but he did not feel victorious. He felt the weight of what might come next. That night, a storm rolled in from the west. Rain pounded the roof of the cabin and thunder shook the hills. He lay awake listening to the downpour, thinking about the drilling rig near the ridge. By morning, the storm had passed. He stepped outside and saw something that made his heart pound. The creek below his field ran brown. He saddled the gray and rode hard despite the slick ground. As he reached the bend where the water widened, he saw fresh erosion along the bank. Mud and debris had washed down from higher up the ridge. He dismounted and knelt, scooping water into his palm. It smelled different, metallic, and sharp. Footsteps approached behind him. The schoolteacher stood there, breathless from the climb. "It's the same near town," she said. "People are noticing." They looked upstream together. The drilling rig was silent now, but the ground around it looked torn and raw. By midday, photos of the muddy creek were spreading through town. Conversations grew louder. The mechanic showed up at the cabin with a small group. "If this gets worse, we're in trouble," he said. He nodded. "It will get worse if they keep digging." Another letter arrived that afternoon. This one was sharper in tone. It warned against interference with ongoing operations and reminded him of the legal consequences of obstruction. He folded it without reading it twice. As dusk settled, he heard engines again. Not one, but several. He climbed the ridge once more, keeping to the tree line. The drilling operation had expanded. Additional lights illuminated the work site. Workers moved quickly, as if racing against something. He stayed hidden among the trees, watching. A large truck backed up to the rig. Sealed containers were loaded carefully. He caught a glimpse of warning symbols on the side of one crate. His stomach tightened. This was more than routine extraction. A worker dropped something near the edge of the site. A clipboard. When the man walked away, he waited until the noise of machinery covered his steps, then slipped closer. He grabbed the clipboard and retreated into the shadows. Back at the cabin, he studied the documents under lantern light. They listed chemical stabilizers and containment procedures far beyond what the public report had mentioned. There were references to pressure levels and emergency response protocols. They were preparing for risk they had not admitted to. A knock at the door made him jump. The mechanic stood there, face pale. "State inspectors are coming tomorrow," he said. Someone filed a complaint. He looked down at the clipboard in his hands. "Good," he said softly. But deep down, he knew inspections could be managed, delayed, redirected. The next morning, a convoy of official vehicles climbed the hill. The suited man greeted them with a steady smile. The town gathered at a distance, watching. He stood beside the gray at the edge of his property, heart pounding. The inspectors walked the site. They spoke in low tones with the company representatives. They took samples from the creek. They examined the drilling equipment. Time stretched painfully. Clouds rolled in again, casting shadows over the ridge. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet earth and something else beneath it. He noticed a faint vibration under his boots. Subtle at first, then stronger. The drilling rig had started again. One of the inspectors turned sharply toward the sound. Voices rose. Not shouting, but urgent. The ground near the ridge shifted slightly, as if unsettled by the pressure beneath. He felt the gray press closer to him. This was the moment everything balanced on. If the inspector saw what he had seen, if the water samples showed what he feared, if the documents in his cabin reached the right hands, then the tide might finally turn. But if the company managed to smooth it over once more, if the drilling continued unchecked, the damage could spread beyond anything the town could repair. The wind howled across the hillside. The machinery roared louder. The creek below churned with muddy force. And he stood there, a fired ranch hand with an old horse in a $3 cabin, watching the mountain decide whether it would hold or give way. The vibration under his boots grew stronger, then suddenly stopped. The drilling rig coughed once and fell silent. A strange hush spread across the ridge. Even the wind seemed to pause. One of the inspectors stepped forward quickly, gesturing toward the base of the machine. Workers backed away, confusion written across their faces. A sharp voice cut through the air. "Shut it down." All of it. The suited man tried to keep his composure, but for the first time since this began, his confidence cracked. He moved toward the inspectors, speaking low and fast. They did not look impressed. A section of ground near the drill site gave way slightly, not collapsing, but sinking just enough to show how unstable it had become after the storm. Mud slid down the slope and carried more debris into the creek below. The brown water churned harder, visible even from where he stood. The lead inspector knelt and touched the damp soil, then looked at the sample bottle in his hand. He exchanged a long glance with another official. Within the hour, red tape had been stretched around the drilling site. Equipment was powered down. Workers stood off to the side, waiting for instructions that did not come. The convoy of state vehicles did not leave. Down in town, word spread quickly. Phones rang. Doors opened. People stepped outside and looked toward the hills. He stayed where he was, one hand resting lightly on the gray's neck. He did not feel victory yet. He felt relief mixed with caution. By late afternoon, the inspectors drove into town and held a brief meeting at the community hall. The room filled again, just like the public hearing, but the mood was different, quieter, expectant. The lead inspector stood at the front with a folder in hand. "We are issuing an immediate suspension of all drilling and extraction activity on the ridge," he announced. "Preliminary findings indicate potential environmental risk not fully disclosed." In the project proposal, a low murmur rolled through the crowd. The suited man stood to object, but the inspector raised a hand. "Further review will determine whether permits were granted based on incomplete information. Until then, operations are halted." The ranch owner who had supported the project stared straight ahead, jaw tight. He did not smile. He simply exhaled slowly. Over the next week, more details came to light. The chemical stabilizers listed on the clipboard he had found were not included in the public documents. The water samples from the creek showed early signs of contamination after the storm runoff. Independent geologists brought in by the state confirmed that the ridge was more unstable than previously reported. The company issued statements about unexpected complications. Investors began to pull back. The drilling equipment was removed piece by piece. It did not happen overnight, but the momentum shifted. The schoolteacher visited the cabin one evening as the sun set behind the hills. She carried fresh bread and a tired smile. "You did not just save your land," she said softly. "You gave people time to see clearly." He shook his head. "We all asked the questions, but you were the one who would not sell." He looked out at the field behind the cabin, where young corn shoots had started to rise again. $3 felt like a lot when I paid it," he said. "Turns out it bought more than I knew." The mechanic found steady work repairing farm equipment instead of construction machinery. He admitted he had been tempted by the promise of quick money, but he was glad he would not have to worry about poisoned water for his child. The ranch hand who once feared speaking up started helping organize community meetings about land rights and environmental protection. He discovered a quiet strength he had not known he had. Even the ranch owner who had fired him came up the hill one afternoon. The man removed his hat and stood awkwardly near the fence. "I was thinking about the past," the ranch owner said. "About that old horse." The gray lifted his head at the sound of voices. "I let numbers cloud my judgment," the ranch owner admitted. "You were right to stand your ground?" He nodded once. No anger remained in him. Only a simple understanding that people sometimes chose wrong and sometimes learned from it. The state investigation took months to finalize. In the end, the permits were revoked due to incomplete disclosures and environmental risk concerns. The development company withdrew from the project entirely. The ridge was left scarred in places, but it was not torn open. Volunteers from town helped plant new grass along the disturbed areas. Fences were repaired. The creek slowly cleared as rain and time washed away the worst of the sediment. Life returned to its steady rhythm. He continued working with horses. Word of the man who had saved an old horse and stood up to a mining project spread beyond the county. People brought him difficult animals others had given up on. He treated each one with the same patience he had shown the gray. The cabin no longer looked like it would fall down in a strong wind. He replaced the sagging roof with sturdy timber. He added a small porch where he could sit in the evenings and watch the valley below. The $3 cabin became something more than a shelter. It became a symbol in quiet conversations around town. Proof that one person's choice could ripple outward. One morning, nearly a year after the first black car rolled up his dirt road, he rode the gray to the highest point of the ridge. The grass had grown back thick in most places. Wildflowers dotted the hillside. The metal survey marker still stood, rusted and forgotten. He dismounted and let the horse graze freely. From up there he could see the entire valley. The ranch where he had once worked, the creek winding clean and bright, the small town with its single main street and steady heartbeat. He thought about the moment he had been fired, about standing in the wind with nothing but an old horse and a stubborn belief that loyalty mattered. If he had made a different choice that day, he would still be drawing a paycheck. He would not own this land. He would not have uncovered the hidden risks buried in official reports. The ridge might already be carved open. Saving the old horse had felt like a simple act of compassion. It turned out to be the beginning of something larger. The gray nudged his shoulder gently, as if reminding him to stay grounded. He laughed softly. "You caused quite a stir," he said to the horse. The animal flicked its ears and continued grazing. Down in town, children played near the now clear creek. Farmers led cattle to drink without fear. The mechanic waved as he passed by in his truck. The schoolteacher organized a small program at the school about caring for local land and water. The community had not become rich from mining profits, but it had become stronger in a different way. That evening he sat on his porch as the sun dipped low. The sky turned gold and then deep blue. The hills stood quiet, not because they were empty of possibility, but because they had been given the chance to remain whole. He thought about the words written by the trapper long ago. They are not telling the whole truth about what lies here. The truth had not just been about minerals or risk. It had been about values, about what people choose to protect. He reached down and ran his hand along the gray's mane. The horse was older now, slower but still steady. The bond between them felt stronger than ever. In the end, he had not needed wealth or influence. He had needed courage, patience, and the willingness to ask hard questions. He had needed a town willing to listen once the facts came into the light. The $3 cabin stood firm behind him, its wooden walls glowing warm in the fading light. It was still simple, still modest, but it held a story in every board and nail. A story about loyalty over convenience, about standing up when it would be easier to step aside, about how one fired ranch hand and an old horse changed the direction of a mountain. As night settled in, he felt something close to peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from knowing you did not back down when it mattered. The wind moved gently across the plains, no longer sharp or cutting. Just a reminder that time keeps moving whether a man is ready or not. He looked out over his land one last time before heading inside. $3 had bought him a cabin. Saving an old horse had bought him a purpose. And together they had saved far more than anyone ever expected.